Maya Gavanen Melanin Amenek Swilaid. I am David of Many Colours and welcome to the final part in our Book 2 series comparing Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring movie with Professor Tolkien's writings. And in this video I'm going to talk all about the ending of the Fellowship movie as well as the ending of the Fellowship book. But I will pick right up where I left off in the last video, and so I'll start this video by talking all about the Fellowship's journey by boat down the Great River Anduin. And in the movies, the main plot points that we see are Gollum following on a log, Aragorn and Boromir's disagreement about going to Minas Tirith, Boromir's kind of mental decline, Saruman's Uruk-hai pursuing them, and of course the awesome Argonath. And all of these things are drawn directly from the books, although, as is kind of like a running theme in these videos, there are still quite a lot of other details that get left out of the movies. So, in the books, the Fellowship spend 9 days travelling down the Great River, and they go a long way south. But to be honest, not much really happens for the first few days. They see a few black swans and other birds that are implied to be servants of the enemy, but it is not until dusk on the 4th day that we encounter anything really worth talking about. So, this scene is pretty faithfully adapted, although in the books it is Sam who spots the log with eyes, and when Frodo relays the information to Aragorn, he reveals that he already knows they're being followed, and he's actually spent a few nights trying to catch Gollum, but to no avail. Which is interesting if we remember that Aragorn and Gollum have totally met before. In the 17 years between Bilbo's 11th birthday party and Frodo's departure from Bag End, Aragorn scoured most of Middle-earth in his hunt for Gollum, and he did eventually capture him and deliver him up to Mirkwood. So, Aragorn is already very familiar with Gollum, and it's likely that Gollum recognizes Aragorn too. Anyway, on the 8th night after leaving Lothlorien, the Fellowship approached the rapids of Gabir. And as far as I know, this part of the books has never been included in any adaptation ever. So, Gabir is the part of the Anduin that flows just above the falls of Rauros, and Aragorn actually tells us that in all his many travels, he has never travelled this part of the river. And honestly, it kind of shows. Because the Fellowship arrive at the rapids a good while earlier than Aragorn anticipated, and unfortunately they do so in the night, which makes the rapids pretty impossible to traverse. So, very sensibly, Aragorn and Boromir decide to turn their boats and paddle towards the shore before they are smashed upon the rocks. But this is where we get a pretty cool action scene that I would love to have seen in the movies. Because as soon as the boats scrape against the shallows, Frodo hears the twang of a bowstring, and he is suddenly hit in the back by an orc arrow. Now, very luckily, Frodo is of course protected by his mithril shirt, but another arrow passes through Aragorn's hood, and one very nearly hits Merry in the hand. Which may seem a little bit like plot armor, but Tolkien reminds us that each of the Fellowship is wearing an elven cloak of Lorien, and their elf-wrought boats are made of grey timber that makes them incredibly difficult for unfriendly eyes to see them in the dark. Anyway, the next question that needs answering is who are these orcs that attack the Fellowship at Gabir? Well, as I mentioned in the last video, there are 3 potential possibilities. There are 3 factions of orcs currently hunting the Fellowship. It could be either the Isengarders, led by Ugluk in the books and by Lurtz in the movies, or it could be the Orcs of Moria, who have been chasing the Fellowship ever since Aragorn killed their chieftain in the Chamber of Mazabul. Or it could be the 3rd faction of orcs, orcs from Mordor, who we aren't introduced to until the Two Towers, but we know from that book that they are active at this point in the story, and they are led by a particularly evil orc called Grishnach. Now, in the Fellowship movie, the only orcs we encounter at this point in the story are Saruman's Uruk-hai, but I don't believe these are the orcs that are shooting at the Fellowship in the books. We are told the orcs attack from the eastern bank of the Anduin, and Saruman's Uruk-hai would definitely approach them from the west. The same is true for the orcs of Moria, which is why I feel relatively confident in saying that this attack is our first introduction to the Orcs of Mordor under the command of Grishnach. And there's another really fascinating piece of evidence to support this that I'll talk about in just a moment, but before I do, I want to point out something that I only learned quite recently about the movies. You see, apparently, Peter Jackson totally did intend to film this scene where the Fellowship are attacked in their boats, and there was even a whole set built on location to facilitate it. But just before filming was scheduled to take place, that part of New Zealand was hit by a record-breaking rainstorm, and the floodwaters rose so high that the entire set was just washed away. Like, so much so that the scene had to be completely cut before it was even put to film, which is such a shame. Anyway, orcs aren't the only evil things that the Fellowship encounters here. As they scramble onto the western shore and take cover from the arrows, they see a dark shape flying above them that is described as blacker than the pits in the night. And as it flies overhead, Frodo feels a deadly cold in his shoulder, right where he was stabbed on Weathertop. Which I think tells us that this flying shape is our first introduction to the winged Nazgul on their new fell beasts. Now, the fierce voices of the orcs rise up to greet this Nazgul, which I think is further evidence to suggest that these orcs are from Mordor. Also, they are straight up referred to as archers of Mordor just a little bit later, which kind of puts the whole issue to rest, really. But it is in this moment that Legolas Greenleaf has one of his most badass moments in all the books. So, I know Legolas is a fan favourite character in the movies, and Peter Jackson gives him quite a few, crazy action sequences that are not present at all in the books. For example, this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. This certainly doesn't happen. But Legolas does have a moment of incredible badassery that is not included at all in the films, and it happens right here. So, as this winged Nazgul flies over the Fellowship, the great bow of Lorien sang, and Legolas shoots an arrow that kills the fell beast immediately. The Nazgul falls out of the sky on the eastern side of the river, and the orcs retreat. And although this isn't a hugely important plot point, it is worth remembering that there is now a lone Nazgul on the east side of the Anduin, which thanks to Legolas is totally stranded without a mount. And this Nazgul is actually mentioned again in the Two Towers, when Merry and Pippin overhear Grishnach talking to Ugluk. So, Grishnach mentions a winged Nazgul awaits us northward on the east bank. To which Ugluk replies, has he had another mount shot under him? And when Grishnach briefly parts company with Ugluk's Uruk-hai, it is to this Nazgul that he returns, to seek further instructions. Anyway, after escaping the orc archers, the Fellowship are left with the decision of how to get past the rapids, which we are told absolutely cannot be traversed by boat. So, the Fellowship wait, while Aragorn and Legolas go off together to scout the land and to see if there's a path where they might carry the boats overland, and then put them back in the water below the rapids. And, luckily, Aragorn and Legolas are successful, and they return with news of a portageway where they can do just that. So, the boats are carried a little way downstream, and thus the rapids of San Gabir are bypassed. And by the next day, the Fellowship encounter the incredible Argonath, the Pillars of the Kings, which mark the old northern border of Gondor. But there is a small yet significant difference between how the Argonath are portrayed in the books and how they're portrayed in the movies. And it's made particularly odd by the fact that in 2012, I think, when the first Hobbit movie came out, the Lord of the Rings books were re-released with a new front cover, and this is the cover that they chose for the Fellowship of the Ring, which is a great visual, but it's a bit bizarre because the book itself describes the Argonath as looking quite different to the way they are portrayed on the front cover of said book. So, in the movies, I don't think it's explicitly stated in any dialogue, but we can be fairly sure that the two kings that are portrayed in the Argonath are supposed to be Isildur and his father Elendil. One king is clearly a lot older than the other, and this makes sense from a film perspective, as both Isildur and Elendil do briefly appear in the prologue of this movie, but from a lore perspective, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. Elendil was never the king of Gondor. I mean, he was the High King of all Dúnedain, and so he ruled the United Kingdoms of Arinor and Gondor, but his seat of power was all the way up north in Arinor, and during his lifetime, the southern kingdom of Gondor was ruled in concert by his two sons, Isildur and Anarion. It is Isildur and Anarion who are represented in the Argonath, and there's no real evidence to suggest that Elendil ever even came to Gondor in his lifetime. In the movies, it makes sense to replace Anarion with Elendil, as all but one reference to Anarion are completely cut from the movies, but it does seem a bit of an oversight for the publishers of the 2012 edition of the Lord of the Rings book to use an image that directly contradicts the description given inside that very book. Anyway, there's another interesting timeline detail that I'll briefly mention here, because if we take a look at the chronology of when everything happens, we can see that on the exact same day that the Fellowship behold the Argonath, elsewhere in Middle-earth, Theodred, son of Theoden, was getting himself killed in the first battle at the Fords of Isen. Now, I'll go into a lot more detail here when I move on to the next book, and Rohan becomes a major part of the plot, but if you're interested in knowing what's happening at the same time as the Fellowship are making their journey, then on this day, Theodred dies, very differently to how he dies in the movies, and then 2 days after this day, Éomer sets out against his king's wishes to hunt the orcs that happen to be carrying Merry and Pippin. So everything really does fit together. And if you're really paying attention, then you'll probably realise that this means Boromir only has 1 day left of his life. So, after passing the Argonath, the Fellowship come to a place called Nen Hithoel, which is portrayed amazingly accurately in the movie. This big spike that's sticking out of the lake is actually called Tol Brandir, and we're specifically told that no man nor beast have ever set foot upon it. And on the east side of Nen Hithoel is a hill that is called Amon Lor, which means the Hill of Hearing. And on the west side of Nen Hithoel is the much more famous hill Amon Hen, which means the Hill of Sight. And Amon Hen is of course where this book ends. So while the Fellowship rest near Amon Hen, they have an incredibly important conversation about their onward journey. And this debate is where we see the complexities of Aragorn and Boromir's characters really shining through. So, as I mentioned a few videos back, the original plan, when the Fellowship left Rivendell, was for Frodo, Sam and Gandalf to go on to Mordor, and for Boromir and Aragorn to go together to Minas Tirith. Legolas, Gimli, Merry and Pippin would then be free to choose their own paths when the time came. But now the time has indeed come, and things have changed since Rivendell. Obviously, Gandalf is no longer with the Fellowship, and so Aragorn finds himself in a really difficult position. On the one hand, I believe he truly does wish to go to Minas Tirith with Boromir, as he originally intended. But now that he's the leader of the Fellowship, he can't just leave Frodo. And so there are really only 3 options available. Either all 8 members of the Fellowship go to Mordor with Frodo, which everyone agrees is needlessly dangerous. Merry and Pippin have absolutely no business in Mordor, and Boromir would be wasted there. Or they could all go to Minas Tirith, which is what Boromir is advocating for. But as we all know, taking Frodo and the ring to Minas Tirith would be disastrous. And so the third option is that the Fellowship breaks, and they go their own separate ways. Now, no one really wants to split up, but I think everyone's kind of resigned to the reality, and upon the slopes of Amon Hen, the Fellowship must decide who'll go where. So, Frodo wisely decides to take a bit of time to himself to ponder his options, Mordor or Minas Tirith. And as he wanders away from the group for an hour of self-reflection, Boromir watches him disappear. And I'm sure we all know what's going to happen with these two, and I'll get to them in just a minute. But before I do, I want to take a brief moment to talk about what the other members of the Fellowship decide. So it obviously goes without saying that wherever Frodo goes, Sam is going too. There's no getting around that. But the other members are each given the option to vote. And the first one to cast his vote is actually Legolas. He says that he would rather go west to Minas Tirith. And Gimli says the same, although he then adds that although he would choose Minas Tirith over Mordor, if Frodo doesn't make the same choice, he will accompany Frodo regardless. And to this, Legolas changes his mind and then says the same thing. But Aragorn makes the very good point that Mordor is no less dangerous for 8 people than it is for 2 or 3. And so he makes the suggestion that Frodo head to Mordor with himself, Sam, and interestingly, Gimli, while Legolas would accompany Boromir, Merry, and Pippin to Minas Tirith. Now, obviously, this isn't what ends up happening, but it is a very interesting what-if. How would the story go if Aragorn and Gimli went with Frodo and Sam through the Dead Marshes and towards the Black Gate? Would they have still taken Gollum as a guide? Probably not. Aragorn has been to Mordor before. He could have been the one to lead them. Would they have taken the pass of Cirith Ungol? What would have happened if Gimli went up against Shelob? The possibilities are endless. Also, I think it's nice to wonder what would happen if Legolas and Boromir spent some quality time in Minas Tirith with Merry and Pippin. Denethor would probably be a lot more welcoming if Boromir was still alive. Legolas would probably get on very well with Faramir, and Merry and Pippin could have become guards of the Citadel together. But then, of course, there is the question of Rohan. If Saruman had successfully conquered them, they wouldn't have come to Gondor's defense, and perhaps Minas Tirith would have fallen before the ring was destroyed. I guess it's another one of those examples where if anything had gone differently, everything would have fallen apart. Anyway, while this conversation is taking place, Sam is the first to realise that Boromir is no longer among them. And everyone kind of gets a sense that this is really bad news, because when Boromir does return, he tells them that he spoke to Frodo, but Frodo put on the ring and vanished. Now, he doesn't tell the full story at this point, but Tolkien tells us that some sudden panic or madness seemed to have fallen on the Fellowship. And Merry, Pippin and Sam all rush off in different directions, shouting Frodo's name, and Legolas and Gimli then rush off into the trees to try and find them, which leaves Aragorn and Boromir. Now, Aragorn tells Boromir to go after Merry and Pippin before they scatter and become lost, while Aragorn hurries to catch up with Sam. So, just before I continue with that thread, let's go back an hour or so and take a look at what Frodo and Boromir got up to while the rest of the Fellowship were having their debate. And to be honest, this scene in the books is remarkably faithful in the movies. In fact, I think this is one of my favourite scenes in the whole trilogy. Sean Bean's acting is wonderful. And although there's a lot more dialogue in the books than in the movie, and Boromir's descent into momentary madness is really amazingly drawn out in the books, almost all the lines in the movie are taken directly from Tolkien. And just like in the movie, Frodo escapes from Boromir by putting on the ring and fleeing up the hill of Amon Hen. And just like in the movie, he never does hear Boromir repent and become himself again. Which is very sad because, of course, these two characters are never going to see each other again. Anyway, at the summit of Amon Hen, Frodo finds an ancient Gondorian stone chair called the Seat of Seeing, and this is where Amon Hen, the Hill of Sight, gets its name. And obviously in the movie, Frodo's visions of Sauron are implied to just derive from him using the ring, but in the book, this seat of seeing is actually quite an important detail. With the ring still on his finger, Book Frodo sits on the seat and he sees parts of Middle-earth that he's never seen before. He looks eastward at uncharted lands and nameless plains, and he looks westward towards Isengard and the plains of Rohan. But everywhere he looks, he sees war. Orcs crawl from holes in the misty mountains like ants from an anthill. Beneath the boughs of Mirkwood, elves and men fight great fell beasts, and the land of the Beornings is aflame. Wolves pour out of Isengard, black ships gather in the havens of Harad, and Easterlings move endlessly upon horses and chariots. When Frodo looks west again, he sees Minas Tirith, but he also sees the grinning gates of haunted Minas Morgul, and he sees the mountains of Gorgoroth and the land of Mordor and Mount Doom and Barad-dûr. And then he hears Sauron's voice and he feels his eye searching for him, moving closer and closer. The Dark Lord's gaze falls on Amon Lor and Tol Brandir, and then Frodo hears a voice in his head, but not Sauron's voice. It says, "Take off the ring." And Frodo does. But neither he nor the reader really know what's going on here until we read the next book. Because in book 3, we learn that the second voice is Gandalf's. And this isn't just some kind of memory of Gandalf telling him not to put the ring on. This is literally Gandalf speaking to him in this moment, all the way from Lothlorien. In the White Rider chapter, we learn that in this moment, Gandalf is sat in a high place, and he strives with the Dark Tower until the shadow passes. So isn't that cool? Even when Gandalf isn't directly in the story, he is still present behind the scenes, helping out the heroes. And so this brings us to the very end of the Fellowship of the Ring book. Just like in the movies, Frodo decides he must go off alone, and Sam decides he'd rather drown than be left behind. And so together they cross the river and they set off east towards the Emin Muil and pass down into the land of shadow. And that is the final line of book 2. But if you're mainly familiar with the movies, then you may very well be thinking that a big part of the story has just been left out. What about the Orc attack? What about the death of Boromir and the capture of Merry and Pippin? Well, all of that actually happens in the first chapter of book 3, titled The Departure of Boromir. And Frodo and Sam don't actually appear at all in that book. We don't see either of them again until book 4. But for the sake of ending this video with the end of the movie, I will move forward just a tiny bit into the first few pages of The Two Towers. And there's actually a really crazy detail here that might even be a mistake on the part of either Tolkien or perhaps more likely the publishers. Because The Two Towers begins with just a very quick synopsis of the Fellowship. And in that synopsis it says, the first part ended with the fall of Boromir to the lure of the ring, with the escape and disappearance of Frodo and his servant Samwise, and the scattering of the remainder of the Fellowship by a sudden attack of Orc soldiers. Except, no, it doesn't. In the Fellowship of the Ring, there is absolutely no mention of any sudden Orc attack at Amon Hen. That doesn't feature until the opening pages of The Two Towers. And I have to say, I think it was an incredibly good decision to end the first movie with the death of Boromir and the capture of Merry and Pippin, instead of trying to begin The Two Towers with that action scene. In fact, and I know I say this quite a lot, but I really do mean it, I think the ending of Fellowship of the Ring is perhaps the best adapted part of the entire movie trilogy. I love it. They even add a farewell scene between Frodo and Aragorn, as well as between Frodo and Merry and Pippin, and these aren't in the books at all, but I actually prefer this movie version to the way that Frodo leaves in the books without a word to anyone. Anyway, as you definitely already know, there is no Lurtz in the book, but Aragorn does hear Boromir's horn, and he rushes as fast as he can to lend aid. But by the time Aragorn finds Boromir, all the orcs are either dead, or they've run off with Merry and Pippin as their captives. And so Aragorn finds Boromir leaning against a tree, pierced with many black feathered arrows. His sword is still in his hand, but it's broken at the hilt, and his horn is split in two. However, all around him are piled the bodies of a great many orcs. Some from Isengard, some from Moria, and some potentially from Mordor. Don't forget, there is a union of 3 independent orc groups attacking the Fellowship at this moment. And in both the books and the movies, Boromir speaks his final words to Aragorn and then dies in his arms. But I think this death comes across as a lot more emotionally brutal in the books than it does in the film. In the film, Aragorn and Boromir, they make peace. But before he dies, the conversation moves into kind of a hopeful direction, and Boromir declares that he would have followed Aragorn as a brother and a king, and he actually dies with hope for his people and hope for the future. But that isn't really the case in the books. Aragorn finds Boromir, and Boromir confesses that he tried to take the ring and that the orcs have captured Merry and Pippin, just like he does in the movie, but then he dies. And his final words are, "Farewell, Aragorn. Go to Minas Tirith and save my people. I have failed." And that's it. That's the end of Boromir. In the books, he's placed in a boat and sent over the falls of Rauros, just like he is in the movie. And in the movie, there is a really, really awesome detail that comes in Howard Shore's soundtrack. So there's one track entitled The Departure of Boromir, and in that piece of music, you can actually hear a choir singing in Sindarin. And among the words they sing are Uvelini vegil a Nayagas, egoi bilina linas. And this is a translation of the first 2 lines of an iconic piece of dialogue that Tolkien wrote and included in The Two Towers. The full quotation goes like this. "I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend." And to make this beautiful sentiment even more poignant, this line of dialogue is actually spoken in the books by Boromir's brother, Faramir. How sweet is that? Major props to the movies for including something that only a massive Tolkien nerd would ever pick up on. But with that, we have come to the end of the Fellowship movie, and so we've come to the end of this little series. But before I finish this video, I have a question for you guys to answer in the comments, because although the next series of videos that I make will return to the First Age, and I will give the epic tale of Beren and Luthien the full Tolkien Untangled treatment, I certainly do intend to return to these books versus movies videos in the future. But my question is this: how would you like me to tackle the second and third movies? For this movie, I split it down the middle with book 1 and book 2, which roughly corresponds with the first half and the second half of the Fellowship movie, but that's not going to work with The Two Towers and The Return of the King. So, would you rather I make a series of videos focusing only on the Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin and Gandalf storylines in the second movie, and then I make another series following Frodo, Sam and Gollum, which is how books 3 and books 4 are written? Or would you rather I just do a longer series where I do what the movies do and splice books 3 and 4 together, telling the Frodo stuff alongside the Aragorn stuff? Bearing in mind that if I do the former, book 3 ends with Gandalf and Pippin riding off to Minas Tirith, which actually occurs in the third movie, and book 4 ends with Frodo being stabbed by Shelob, which occurs really far into the third movie. So I guess what I'm really asking is, should this series be focused on the movies and comparing them to the books, or should they focus on the books and compare them to the movies? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Anyway, as I say, it will be a little while before I get back to The Lord of the Rings because I am super excited to announce that the next video I release will continue the First Age series, and it will begin the amazing story of Beren and Luthien, which I am astoundingly excited to talk about. It really is one of my absolute favourite stories ever put to pen by Tolkien. I know I say that a lot, but it's true, I swear. Beren and Luthien is the bomb. So, to make sure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and I really hope you enjoyed this video and this whole little series, in fact, and if you did, then don't forget to hit like and leave a comment, and I'd love it if you guys would share this channel with friends and family and fellow Tolkien fans, as that is the best way to help grow the channel. Anyway, new videos will be coming soon, but until then, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.